So since we started talking about the dimensions, let's, I think before we dive into 9 dimensions, you would say there are 9, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So let's touch on the difference between dimension and density.
Yeah. Yes. When we're talking about just dimension, we are talking about a plane, so and a space. So this is the third dimension. That's where we live. But if there is a 3D, at least there must be a 1D and a 2D, right?
Yes.
At least. And so when we're talking about dimension, it is the space. So like the 2D is actually the underworld, is the what we call the telluric realm. So that space between the very center of the Earth, which is the first dimension. It's the iron core crystal of the planet Earth, and the space between that core crystal and the crust of the Earth, which is where we are, that's the second dimension. And then the third dimension is where the physical and non-physical intersect.
Right.
So then when we're talking about the higher dimensions, it becomes non-physical. It becomes light dimensions. So it's like the subtle frequencies.
Interesting.
And so it's related to density too, because so again, the first dimension is the densest, and it's the most solid because it is actually the gravity. It's the gravity in all of the other planets. And so the higher you go, the less dense it is. So the second dimension is still very dense. And here in the third dimension is still dense, but not as dense as the lower ones, and not as lighter as the higher ones.
Right.
And so when we add the consciousness to it, then we're talking about the level of consciousness in each dimension.
How would you define consciousness?
I define consciousness as that seed of life. Is that seed that created all there is, and we all share that one seed. There's an analogy that I've heard once from Dr. Wayne Dyer, who I love, and he talks about something along the lines of having an apple pie and then cutting a slice, putting it on a plate, and then he asks, is this still an apple pie? Yes, it is. It looks like it's separate from the whole, but it is still an apple pie with the same ingredients. And so the one consciousness is that seed that created all. And we perceive ourselves as separate slices of apple pie, but we actually come from that whole.
Makes sense.
And so if I add the consciousness factor to the dimensions, each dimension has a different level of consciousness. And when I say level, I'm not necessarily saying it's better or worse. It's just lower and higher. We here in the 3D, one of the characteristics of the 3D level of consciousness is that we see things through duality. Yes. So that's why we might feel like the lower one is bad and the higher one is better. But it's kind of like the same with the chakras, like your lower chakras, they're not worse than your upper chakras. They're just connecting you to your primal needs, your humanness, and the 3 upper chakras, they're connecting you to the spiritual realms. So it's kind of the same. And actually each dimension is connected to a chakra. But there is also, from the law of one material, they talk about the density of consciousness. So like instead of like 3D being the third dimensional level of consciousness, they talk about the third density of consciousness. So it's a different terminology. I think it's the same. I see it as the same thing, but just like a different way of explaining things. Because they talk about seven densities of consciousness, which are literally related to the 7 main chakras.
Right. And then the Ra is a part of a social memory complex who is in 6th density right now. Yeah,
Yes, yes.
amazing
And
material, by the way. I love
I,
listening to Aaron Apke when he talks about it.
yeah, me too. I've learned a lot from him, and he was actually a guest on my podcast, and we talked about those differences between densities and dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when he talked about, or the law of one material talks about going into the fourth density, which is where we are now, from third density into fourth density as a planet.
Mm-hmm.
It's the equivalent to going from 3D to 5D,
Five,
5D
yeah.
consciousness. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because then you transcend time, right? Like three dimension, it's basically a dimension where you still have, past, present, and future. Then you raise above it, and you all you see is like everything is one, so that you transcend time. Time is no longer linear, like you said, right? And
Yeah.
that will bring you to fifth dimension,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
When you
Yeah.
transcend time.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. So then let's talk about nine dimensions.